On behalf of Namita Gokhale and William Dalrymple and all my colleagues at Teamwork Arts, welcome back to JLF Brave New World. Those of you who missed out on our earlier sessions, including the outstanding Piku Iyer, Peter Carey, Jhumpal Lahiri, Siddharth Mukherjee, Prayag Akbar, Edmund de Waal, Alain de Botton, and so many others, you can catch up with them on our Facebook page, JLF Lit Fest, and on our YouTube channel, Jaipur Lit Fest JLF. To tell you more about the stellar list of writers we have lined up for you during these coming months, please welcome festival directors Namita Gokhale and William Dalrymple.
Dear friends of literature, friends of JLF, we are delighted at the response from all of you to our first digital session some days ago. And we return again today with more programming which looks at the world around us, the brave new world we are trying to understand and to access. Do tune in, do link in, do engage, do comment as we celebrate books, dialogues, and literature.
Hello, my name is William Dalrymple. I'm one of the co-directors of the Jaipur Literature Festival, and I'm here to encourage you to turn on for Brave New World. This is the Jaipur in Exile online digital festival. We have an extraordinary array of writers. There are not many positive things coming out of this terrible pandemic, but one positive thing is that all the writers we've ever wanted at Jaipur, who for one reason or another weren't able to make it so far, have all said yes. And we have writers such as Robert Macfarlane, Peter Carey, Alain de Botton, Edmund de Waal, writers we have longed to bring to you before, who've been too busy or unable to make the journey, who are now going to make it digitally online to a screen near you. So lock down, log in, and join us, please, for Brave New World.
Thank you, Namita. Thank you, William. Our first session today on JLF Brave New World is Yoga in a Time of Crisis. Since the coronavirus pandemic paralyzed the world, social media has been full of people spending lockdown practicing yoga. In this session, SOAS Professor of Sanskrit, Yogic Mahant, Sir James Mallinson, tells Yashaswini Chandra about the history of yogic isolation and how yogis have used solitude and stillness to plumb the inner depths. He also reveals how only very recently in its long history, yoga has come to be seen as a form of calisthenic exercise. Sir James, or Jim Mallinson, is an Indologist based at SOAS University of London who works primarily on the history of yoga and its practitioners. His research is informed by Sanskrit texts, art historical material, and more than a decade spent living in India with traditional yogis. He was anointed Mahant of the Ramanandi Sampradaya at the 2013 Kumbh Mela, all the way from his cave in Wiltshire. Welcome, Jim. Thank you so much for joining us. Jim today is in conversation with Yashaswini Chandra, who has a PhD in History of Art from SOAS University of London and has taught courses on Indian and Himalayan art and culture at SOAS, JNU, and Ashoka University. Her forthcoming books include The Tale of the Horse, A History of India on Horseback, and Mem Sahib's Mistresses, Maids, and Missionaries, Women of Colonial India. Remember, please do comment and ask questions by typing it in the comment section. Do also follow our handles JLF Lit Fest on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram to get notified on the upcoming sessions. In case any of you drop off due to bandwidth issues, you can find us on our YouTube channel, Jaipur Lit Fest JLF. Ladies and gentlemen, Yoga in a Time of Crisis, James Mallinson in conversation with Yashaswini Chandra.
Hi, Jim. Can you hear me?
Yes, hello, Yashaswini.
Hi. So, as Sanjay was mentioning, you are doubly qualified to take us through the subject of yoga and the ascetic traditions of isolation at a time when more and more of us are turning to yoga to find solace through these terrible times. It may comfort us, in fact, to learn that yoga, in its original sense, involved isolating oneself and doing nothing. But before we move on to that, I wanted to ask you about the origins of yoga. While the seeds of yoga can be traced back to the Vedas, it emerged as a definite knowledge system and practice in times not dissimilar to what we are going through in a time of crisis. Is that not right?
Yes, I mean that is certainly an argument for a way of describing the period in which yoga first gets formalized in texts, in particular the Pali Canon, the stories about the Buddha. So we're talking about the period, the 5th and 4th centuries BC, and that is the second great urbanization in South Asia, because the first valley, and then for a long time there's no evidence of any cities, and then around the 5th, 4th century BC, cities start appearing predominantly in north central India. So in particular in the region known as Magadha, kind of bordering, I guess, kind of Bihar, bordering Bengal, UP, that kind of region. And associated with the appearance of urbanization, a bit like, I think we can draw parallels with globalization today, is a rise in disease. We've got lots of people living, huge numbers of people living together for the first time, or the first time for 2,000 years. And so that resulted in much more spread of disease. And it's thought that perhaps it's in response to this that these new ideas first appear in Indian thought during this period. And these are ideas that we think, that are normally understood to be kind of from the origins of all Indian religious tradition. We really see them to form around then. And they are the ideas of reincarnation and karma. So your actions in this lifetime affect what happens in the next lifetime. And then the notion that all this is suffering, this is bad news, you don't want to do this. I think in the introduction it was said that perhaps we can take solace from yoga in a time like this, and maybe we can. But I've been thinking about this in the run-up to the talk. It's a pretty pessimistic worldview, though. It's founded on a very pessimistic worldview that life is suffering. And what was going on during this period, the 4th, 5th century BC, particularly in this region known as Magadha in north central India, there were lots of new religious groups kind of confronting these new questions. The question is, how do we solve this problem of suffering? And the usual answer that was given is to somehow get off the wheel of rebirth, to get enlightened. And one of the ways of responding to this was yoga. It's not quite yoga as we understand it, and we might get onto that. An important point to remember is that in that time, yoga and these practices was very much associated with kind of professional ascetics. And the classic illustration of this is the Buddha wandering around. So in these stories of his life before he gains enlightenment, he's wandering around in this area, meeting lots of different types of religious practitioners doing different things. And let's see if I can make my share screen work. There's these famous images from, how's that? Can you see that?
Yes.
See if I can make that start play. So these images of the fasting Buddha. In fact, I was just in Pakistan last month, and so the images of the fasting Buddha are from the northwest of India, from the Gandharan tradition, probably from 2nd or 3rd century BC onwards. So what the story is at the background, and he tried everything that he saw, and he kind of does everything to the max, to the extreme, and he knows that there are people out there practicing holding their breath, fasting, and associated with that, we do also in some stories hear some sort of physical techniques. But in those days, physical techniques were all about controlling and subduing the body. So standing up for long periods, and the Buddha himself says that. He said he became a stander-up, a rejecter of seats. And then in the usual narrative, he rejects all these extreme practices. Although it seems that in some of the early Chinese translations, he doesn't. So it's the kind of debatable point about whether he rejects it all. But yeah, to get back to your question, sorry, I've rambled on a bit, but it's during this period, and some people would argue, I think it's not a question we can ever fully answer, but some people would argue that this came about as a result of urbanization and the resulting problems and suffering that came from that, amongst which was disease.
So But originally, you've made this point, and from what you've told me about the origins of yoga, originally it was more a matter of isolating oneself, and this association with exercise comes along later. Your own, your own. I think you mentioned that your own training. You told me once your own training as a sadhu also involved learning to do nothing. And I don't know if you learned, if it also involved learning breathing exercises, postures, but you've made that point that this association between yoga and exercise is a relatively recent one, that for the longest time it just involved sort of, as you said, professional ascetics isolating themselves.
It was about controlling the mind. And I was reading something today, and it reminded me that a lot of when we read about yoga in early sources, it's about drawing into yourself, withdrawing your senses, putting them into your mind, and then your mind into yourself. So it's very much a process of and then around 1,000 years ago, yes, we see this whole new shift. And this is the focus of my research at the moment. I've been doing this research project for nearly 5 years, looking at the physical techniques of yoga. And what I've come to realize is that until 1,000 years ago, we have no evidence for